ahead and start. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for attending. Can we go inside? Migrating to Esri's indoors for space planning and asset tracking. Our next speaker today is Michael Blair from Innovate. Michael is a manager in the IT/GIS division of Innovate Incorporated, headquartered in Washington, D.C., with remote staff throughout the United States, where he serves as a digital strategist and geospatial developer. Questions at the end? Wait till the end for any questions. Then, just repeat so that people online can hear. Anybody who is online virtually right now, encouraged to enter their questions into the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end as well. Anybody else who is a virtual attendee, please make sure your name is correct on your Zoom login so you can get credit for attending. This session is being recorded and will be available on the conference website in a few weeks after this event. So thanks for attending. I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Good morning. Welcome to the last day of the conference. How many of you know of ArcGIS Indoors? Good amount of people here. That's good. So the whole notion of going indoors is, fairly new with regard to GIS, right? So GIS being, everything outside, but now we're migrating to trying to keep track of all of this stuff inside. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Innovate. I'm not going to read all of this. We are a women minority-owned small business. Like was mentioned, we are headquartered in Alexandria, Virginia. We have a remote office in Sandpoint, Idaho. Why Sandpoint? Because the director of ITGIS lives there. So we have a big contingent of folks out in the Pacific Northwest. As you see, we've been doing geospatial stuff for a long time. I personally been doing it for over 30 years. Yes, I started when I was 2, because I'm not that old. We do have a lot of specialties. I'm not going to bore you with all the things Innovate, but just give not a lot of people know who we are. My colleague Jenny Herring is also lives in Wilmington. I'm in New Bern. So we do have a North Carolina presence as well. So next slide. Just a little touch on, we do work in really every sector. So if you're in any of these groups, we probably have touched you in some way, and always looking to expand our network. Next slide. So let's actually get into why you're here. So if you're dealing with any space management, asset tracking, space utilization, especially over the last couple of years where y'all were working in an office. I've been remote for the last 30 years, so I'm used to taking that 2-minute commute down from my bedroom to my office. But a lot of folks that are in offices have kind of seen a shift in the last couple of years, right? So you were in the office and then something happened in the world and everyone said, you all got to work from home. And now people are trying to figure out how to come back. But there's also all of these different pain points that you're trying to figure out. New employee comes in the office. We have a big office space, lots of buildings, especially like we work for EPA and the RTP, and there's lots of buildings, lots of spaces, lots of floors. Going, hey, I gotta figure out. I need a room that I can have a meeting. Is that available? Well, we have this Outlook calendar. Is it up to date? Or, hey, I just got hired. I need to print something out. Did I print it on the 15th floor or the first floor? I don't know where the heck this thing is. Or I need to have a meeting. How do I get there? I get lost. So applications are certainly big buildings. If you're working in governmental space, higher ed, lots of applications for going indoors and using ArcGIS indoors. Next slide. So pre-indoors, so indoors came out about 3-4 years ago now. Prior to that, we actually built a custom application using the local space plan data model. And we were trying to figure out basically how do we do this where we can keep track of assets and do the space utilization, because some of you in this room don't probably remember Lotus Notes or even who the heck Lotus was. I know some of you in this room are kind of as old as I am, and know what Lotus Notes is. But basically, it was a tracking system, a database. And then also we have all of this CAD data and trying to keep track of all this stuff. So we built a custom application and deployed it, and it worked really well. And actually, it's still in use today at EPA. But it was always this constant processing, and we have Python scripts, and we have all these ETL tools. So I'm going to talk to you guys about some of the pain points and how to not make the mistakes that we did over the years. So if you do want to go to use, ArcGIS indoors, that you can not make the same mistakes. So next slide, please. How many of you have experience with CAD or work with your CAD folks? And about half of you. And I'm sure online is equally the same. CAD people are, I'll use the term, interesting. And I say that with tongue in cheek in that they don't care about the data other than it looks really good, right? So we had people, our CAD folks, drawing chairs, literally that chair, that had the casters, the wheels on the chair, and there were like 10,000 vertices to draw a chair. And they're like, well, that's not a problem. It looks really great. Yeah, it looks great, but it's made the data ginormous. So when we brought it into the GIS and to render it, it was just bloatware. So we had to optimize the CAD data. And this is why I'm sharing a lot of the lessons learned, because we went through the process of automating and the system to get rid of all of the junk. Still make it look okay, but not have it be the casters on the chairs and all of these pieces. So we ran through and we thinned out the data to make it render fine in GIS and also look okay. Next slide. So that's your first lesson. Then we had to deal with who the heck space is this? Because in this diagram, in this picture, the yellow is actually, quote unquote, the office, but in your indoors, in your space, how do we actually identify whose room it is? Because they're shared spaces. So we had to cut this room in half because just because it's a cubicle, we need to identify and specifically say, Sally works here and John works there. So you had to split the room in half and actually digitize in that split. But where do you do it? Because with indoors, it has to have a specific unit or space. So lesson 2, you have to define your spaces. So even if you're sharing spaces, they must be defined. Next slide, please. And then the lovely data issues. Where's the wall? How do you get to that spot on the bottom? You can't, there's a wall. There's no door. So we ran into lots of data issues. Spatial data not referenced correctly. We had floors that were in CAD, looked great, but they were literally next to each other in space. Well, I don't know about you, but floor 1 is not next to floor 2. It's on top. Floor 2 is on top. But the AutoCAD person said, no, I'm going to literally put these next to each other because I want to keep them separate so I don't have a bowl of spaghetti. Well, geospatially, that doesn't work. So we had to align the floors to each other. And sometimes the floors didn't actually align. So we had to do some rubber sheeting and some georeference of that. The polyline data, there's no topography, and the topology is a mess. Overshoots, undershoots, not closed. So you have to spend a lot of time managing the data. And Jenny in the room is, she's managing many of our technicians and can probably attest to a lot of the folks that are sitting there as technicians, they spend a lot of time moving vertices, snapping things together. Inconsistencies, right? So windows that may be on the exterior or interior, the naming of the layers. The project for EPA, Region 1 might name an exterior wall EXT/wall. Region 3 might actually spell it out. Well, those are inconsistent. So we had to have consistencies. And then they don't conform to the data model. So indoors uses the local data schema, and it's not consistent. Next slide, please. Some more interesting ways of digitizing spaces, and these are real. We didn't make this up. This is how the CAD folks drew that door in the middle of what? I don't know. The wall. Okay. So these are things that if you're going to go to indoors and you want to bring this CAD data in, these are things to keep an eye out. I won't quote the exact statistic that has been thrown out there of how much data management you're supposed to allocate as part of your project planning, but we'll say it's far less than what it actually takes. They say, oh, it's about 10% of the entire project. It's about 50% at least. So just take that into consideration if you're going to go to indoors. Next slide. Then one of the other components, and I touched on this earlier, was around the naming convention. So the way that indoors works, if you use the automated tool, there's an import from AutoCAD to indoors. It uses the annotation layer. And the annotation layer gets pulled in, and it's used to attribute the room. Well, if you have abbreviations, that doesn't work. Or you have inconsistencies. So if you have conference spelled out versus conf or exterior, they don't work. And so now you have inconsistencies with your room types, and you don't know, you have to spend a lot of time cleaning all that up after the fact, post-processing. So again, lesson learned. I'm sharing this with you because I don't want you to make the same mistakes that we did and have to go through all the problems. Next slide. So data collection, you can use a really cool photogrammetry tool. We actually partnered with another vendor for some work that we did with a local tribe that had no data, which was a godsend, honestly. When you have no data, you're starting from scratch. So we had them do all the data collection. They spit out very clean CAD data. We were able to literally 5 minutes later ingest that using the automatic tool in ArcGIS Pro, built out this beautiful CAD data. None of that junk that I shared with you before existed. It just was clean and pure. All these blue dots are where they actually did the photogrammetry data collection, and then we ingested it. Next slide. So if you have nothing, I would highly recommend going there. So this is that beautiful CAD data, all attributed nicely, brought into the indoors data model. Looks great. Next slide. So some things to be mindful of, even if you have beautiful CAD data, the attribute data fields must align. So as a database administrator, makes sense. You need to have primary key, foreign key match. If you don't, it makes the processing a royal mess, because I'll talk to you about some of the steps that you have to go through. One of the pieces is, and I love Esri. I've been working with them for many years. Their error messages aren't always the best. We'll just say that. So when you get a 999 error message in indoors, I don't know what happened. Or we had one case, I was working with one of our technicians a couple weeks ago. Success, it worked. There was no data that got spit out. So Indoors thought that it did what it was supposed to do, but actually didn't actually create anything. And it ended up being the attribute data was not consistent between there's a number of data layers and it needed to be consistent. And once it did, it ran and spit out the data fine. So again, be mindful of your attribute data and making sure that they're aligned. Next slide. So the process of going through indoors, so getting your data into the indoors data model is the first step. So if it's from CAD, you had nothing, you did your photogrammetry, you already had a GIS data layer or layers, that's your first step. Your second step, once you have all that, you have to create and identify your traversable or navigable areas. So it creates this lattice work. One of the things that happens when you create your lattice, and again, these are all automated tools, so you're not painstakingly going through this process, but you have to identify which layers or data are or are not traversable. And so if it's a wall or if it's a chair, if it's an exterior space, what have you. Even if your data is great, which this is, it still does not, areas that are really close, the lattice doesn't get created. So you have to manually connect your doorways and snap your vertices. So again, something to keep in mind if you have, even if you make the lattice as small as you possibly can, which is about 0.2 meters, it still won't always snap all your doorways. So if you have very large campuses or buildings, like for EPA, we have one building that has 15 floors and it's ginormous. The Reagan building, if you're familiar with it in DC, it's like an entire city block. So it's very big, many floors, many offices, and it's painstaking to have to snap between your doorways between the two spaces. But you have to do that, otherwise it won't, when you go to the navigation, it actually doesn't work. So again, lesson learned, something to keep in mind when you're budgeting out how much time it's going to take. Next slide. So that's the second step. Third step is you have to create transitions. This doesn't look really sexy at all, but these are stairwells. So when you create a transition, again, it's an automated process. You run create transitions. It creates a transition for elevators and it creates transitions for stairs. The stairs, when it does it, only creates this transition in one location. So it looks like a dot on the map. If you look at it in 3 dimensions, it looks like a line, which an elevator is a line, right? It's a vertical structure, it goes up and down. Stairs don't, right? So stairs go from here to here to here, depending on the stairwell. So you have to manually go in and edit the transitions for stairwells to put the vertice in the middle of the stair so you have your change in direction and actually calculate the Z value of each one of those stairwells. Again, a manual process. If you have a lot of stairs, it takes quite a while. Next slide. Next step is to simplify. So that great lattice work that you create and the transitions that gets created, it's really garbage. It never gets used. So you do all of this painstaking work and then you simplify your network into these lines. And the lines are what gets used by the applications, which I'm going to show shortly, to do your navigation, to do your space utilization. So you can see that in some of these cases, there's just a line touching the room. So that great lattice work that looked really pretty gets simplified into a line that says, I can get from this room to that room. That's all it does. And these big old spiders, all it is making the interconnections. And it's used for both your web and your mobile applications. Next slide. Eye candy. So 3D visualizations of your building is really only used to make a pretty picture. I think the plenary or one of the sessions was talk about, 3-dimensional LiDAR and metaverse and all of these things and walking through. it could be used for that, but it's really just eye candy. Thank you. Next slide. So so after you have all your beautiful data, you publish it into data viewers. So there's two systems. One is a data viewer application, so that you can interact with all of your different data and navigate between them. You go to the next slide. I think that there's the video on that next slide. Thank you. So here's the actual use of this data viewer. So I can go from one building to another building. We can navigate to that building. We can go to different floors, and all of this is out of the box. So once you have your data, you publish a configurable app in ArcGIS Online or in Portal. And all of these features and functions are just right out of the box. So I can search, I can navigate, I can go from one room to another. It gives turn-by-turn directions. I can say, I don't want to walk. I need to use a wheelchair or other device. And it will give you all of that data. And it's as good as the data that you put into it. But you can see it does that turn-by-turn directions and tells you, how far is it going to take, how long is it going to take, et cetera. Next slide. And then with regard to integration, you can integrate it with Survey 123. And if we go to the next slide, I think there's an animation on that one. Or it might be on this one. Here we go. So you can also, using Survey 123, you can integrate it. So if a light bulb goes off in a room, we can do a work order. So we have we have a request that kicks out to Survey 123. We can enter in what the problem was. A light bulb was busted in this room. It gets tied geographically to that feature, and then you can have it all interconnected. It can also connect to other systems like Workforce or Cartograph or other components. So it can be a nice feature for your buildings and grounds or your operations and maintenance and working through that. Next slide. And then lastly is space utilization, space planning. So we needed to, for EPA specifically, they wanted to bring people back in the office and wanting to know how far. So the purple rings around offices are that 6 feet social distancing space. So they wanted to identify where there overlap and being able to make sure that they can put people in the right room and where there's not this conflict. Next slide, and I think there's the last animation on that one. So in this example is you have people that are assigned to rooms. So if you want to do space planning, space utilization, you can move people from individual rooms, or you can also set up what's called hot desking or hoteling. So you can have a block of rooms that are not assigned to any individual, but people are coming in remote 2 days a week and working 2 days a week in the office. You can set up these spaces so that they can assign, or just like you do booking a hotel, you can do the same thing with indoors, and that will integrate with your Office 365 system. It can tie into your calendaring, so it can be used for either conference rooms or physical office space, and being able to plan out that space and also being able to assign or unassign different rooms. And I think that's the last slide, if you want to advance one more. And with that, I'll open it up to any questions if you have any. And I'll hide that so people don't tell me. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is it easy to move the data from indoors into web maps, et cetera? And the answer is yes. So out of the box, both your space planner and your data viewer are mobile friendly. So you can embed a QR code, and And if you take the QR code, you can open up the app. It's directly on your phone or a tablet, and it's out of the box, reactive and mobile ready. Which is, it's a great feature. And that's why that work order, survey 1, 2, 3 tie. So we can send the work order, you can be in the room and it knows where you are. One thing I did leave out is, integrated positioning systems or blue dot. It's getting better. And in the future, hopefully next release next year or within another year or two, all that indoor positioning systems, currently you have to put out beacons, but in the future it's going to use Wi-Fi. So in any device that is throwing off a signal, which is everything that we have in the world, throwing off either Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and it will enable that indoor positioning system automatically. I think I saw a hand in the back. Okay. Yeah, so indoor positioning system is going to be something that is, is really wave of the future. There's a company, Geocom, that is doing a lot of that indoor positioning system for emergency response. But indoors with emergency response is going to be, if it isn't already on your radar, it should be on your radar, regardless of what industry that you work in. If you have a space that has people that are working in it, in emergency response, and the use of indoors is critical. So if someone, had an issue right now, call 911, where are you? I have no idea what room this is. Yeah, question? Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the question is, any use cases or where that is being implemented locally? Is that, or anywhere? Yeah, so I believe Texas A&M is doing it. That has done it. There are a number of groups, agencies that are doing it. We did a pilot for Joint Base Andrews for emergency response with indoors. So active shooter drills, or they had an air show, one of their largest air shows. Joint Base Andrews is the presidential base, if you're not familiar with that. So where Air Force One is housed. So a lot of dignitaries come in. So we were working with them to identify basically sniper positions that they could have line of sight. Also, if a fire happens in said building or some emergency response. So you can use indoors for that to send out an active alert to emergency responders to say, hey, in room 119 in building ABC, there's an incident, and even if someone doesn't, that first responder doesn't know where that is, they can actually be directed to that. And that can be used for emergency response, or simply, the light bulb blew, or, we need to change an air filter. So with that, I think my time is up. Thank you.